Have you ever been in a situation where you can see the problem but not the answer? For me, that was most of high school when it came to maths. There were problems everywhere, but answers weren't readily coming forward for me. But there's other areas of life where the problem is much more serious than an equation, and so we wish we could have an answer. A friend of mine was doing some filming for Introducing God, and the people that were helping with the production said, "Hey, can we come to your house and look at your wardrobe?" Now that's a pretty confronting moment. And they went to his bedroom and said, "Look, no, not good enough." And so they went out clothes shopping, and he's sort of trying on shirts and trying to figure out what to wear. And then suddenly there's this almighty crash and this bang, 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 and there's enormous screaming and yelling, and there's this woman screaming that just pierces the air. And he thought, oh, what's happened? As a parent lost it with her child in the next shop. It was just awful, and it sounded completely out of control. You couldn't be a responsible person and not try and step in somehow. And so my friend walks into the jewellery shop next door, and there's this big guy. He's got a black ski mask on. He's holding a big knife, and there's two other men like him also wearing masks. One of them has a hammer and he's belting the cabinets of the jewellery shop, and the other has a knife and he's holding against the face of the owner of the shop, and she's got blood starting to flow down her face, and there's two women lying on the floor, one lying on top of each other, both screaming. And my friend looked at his bare hands. He'd come to bring justice, and there's a bloke bigger than him holding a knife. He wasn't competent to fix the problem. And so what did he do? Well, he went straight back into the clothes shop. He rang the police, and so there's my friend, his production mate, the shop assistant, just sitting there, looking at the things that the clothes were hanging on, and thought, could we turn them into weapons? But a clothes hanger versus a knife, well, there's nothing they could do. He could see the problem, but just not the answer. And there are things in each of our lives that we desperately want fixed, that we don't have the answer for. Well, let's remind ourselves where we've come from and the story so far, because so far we've seen the problem, but not the answer. You see, we saw at the beginning of God's biography, as we began to be introduced to God, that we saw that there was a God who created the world. It's the God we discover on the pages of the Bible. And we've seen that's a trustworthy document. We've seen that God's in charge and we are his creatures under his rule. And back in the garden, there's no robberies, there's no cancer, there's no back pain. But then we declared autonomy. We went our own way. And the consequences were that God's beautiful world, well, it's not beautiful anymore. There's suffering. There's sickness, there's death. Hurt people hurt people. And God, who made us, he is angry at our snubbing of him, and God holds us accountable. And we saw last week that there was judgment and there was death. And we saw last time God's method of dealing with autonomy. It's going to involve a person. God's going to appoint a king who's going to crush all evil. And so in this session, we meet Jesus. He's the one appointed by God to put things right. Now, bit of a note about Jesus. We've already spoken about the reliability of the scriptures. And I want to say to you that the question of Jesus as a historical figure is not something that is doubted by serious historians. Most historians, Christian or not, they are more than happy to study the historical Jesus like they study Alexander the Great. And historically, there are two events in Jesus' life that most would accept. That Jesus was baptized by a guy called John, and that Jesus died by crucifixion. So when we start to look at Jesus, might he be the answer to our autonomy problem? I know that I'm not, and you're not. Well, is Jesus the answer? Well, let's have a look together. And when we start to look at Jesus, he's actually very different to all the pictures that most people have of Jesus. And there's all sorts of images of Jesus out there, but today we're going to look at the original Jesus. the Jesus we read about in the pages of the Bible. We're going to meet him. We're going to look at 4 snapshots in the life of Jesus before we have a look at what happens to him at the end of his life. Now, the first snapshot we see is Jesus' extraordinary authority over nature. And here we're in Luke chapter 8, and we're going to start at sentence 22. It says, "One day Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let's go over to the other side of the lake.' And so they got into a boat and set out. As they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake, so the boat was being swamped, and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, 'Master, Master, we are going to drown.' He said, 'There's this big storm. Things are starting to get out of control.' You pick it up in sentence 24. It says, Jesus got up and he rebuked the wind and the raging waters. Jesus stands up and he just says, 'Be still.' And the storm subsides and all was calm." Back at a previous church, we'd spent a lot of money trying to upgrade our roof because it kept getting leaks. And one time there was a big sort of rain event after we'd spent a lot of money trying to fix it all up. And the guy said, "There won't be any leaks any longer." And so I went down to check it out and walked into the foyer and looked up, and all through the light fittings, there's just water gushing out. And so I went outside and I looked up at the sky and I said, "Stop!" And do you know what happened? Nothing. Because I don't have that authority. But Jesus, he says, "Stop," and the wind and the waves cease. There's calm. You see, the first snapshot is we see Jesus exercising the very authority of God over nature. Well, the second snapshot is Jesus having authority over sickness. See, jump down to sentence 40 again in Luke chapter 8. And what happens here is there's this guy, his name's Jairus, and he's got a daughter who is dying, and Jesus goes to do something to help him. But while he's on his way, sentence 43, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know the power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing she could no longer go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Now here's a woman. She has a problem. No one has an answer for her. And so she reaches out to Jesus. Now, I've got a sister-in-law who's a doctor. I know other people who are specialists at top hospitals, but none of them consult like this in an instantaneous, total, no complications sort of way. Jesus has the very authority of God over sickness. The third snapshot is Jesus exercising God's authority over even death. It's to pick up the story, because while Jesus is healing this woman, Jairus' daughter dies. Pick it up in sentence 49. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead, but he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, and he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. This third snapshot is quite remarkable. Jesus exercising the very authority of God over death. Now that's authority out of my experience. I remember one time our eldest daughter, she got given some medicine that she didn't necessarily should have got given. And so we had to take it to the emergency department. And while we were waiting there, a call comes in, a serious bike accident is coming in. And let me say, those doctors, they do amazing things. They are totally cool under the pressure. But it's a whole different order of ability, is it not? To raise the dead. Jesus has the authority of God over life and death. He is the answer in the face of death. Our fourth snapshot is that Jesus is competent to deal with evil. Now, this is a big one for us. We've seen that the problem of autonomy from last week is ultimately a problem of evil. And jump back to sentence 27. When Jesus stepped ashore, this is after he's calmed the storm, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but had lived in the tombs. Now, this man, his name is Legion. He has many problems. He's been the loser in a cosmic supernatural battle. His life is dominated by evil. Evil spirits have taken over his personality. He has multiple demons. He lives amongst the tombs. It's a long time since he's worn clothes, lived in a house. And here we have Jesus, God's authoritative king, coming face to face with a man who represents evil. Pick it up what happens. Sentence 28. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." Now, this is the demons speaking to Jesus. They know they're in a bad situation. And despite their numbers and power, they know that Jesus has unparalleled authority. They recognize Jesus as the King, the Most High God, and they don't like it. It's the classic good versus evil. And the evil know that they are going to lose. So what does Jesus do? Well, sentence 29, Jesus demonstrates that he has authority over evil. For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Well, what's Jesus going to do with the evil spirit? Sentence 31, they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. Now, what's the abyss? Well, it's the place where the disobedient, the unclean spirits, the demons are kept. It's awful. They don't want to go there. So sentence 32, a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs. And the effect is immediate and visible, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. And so somehow, in some sense here, the animals are sacrificed for the sake of the man. And we start to get this idea that the removal of evil costs something. The loss of the pigs graphically indicates that purging evil is costly, it's expensive. But for those watching on, it's amazing to see this exorcism. Here's a man who was naked, now he's clothed. Here's a man who was roaming, now he's seated. This man was a loner, now he's sitting at Jesus' feet. This man was crying out, now he's comfortable in Jesus' presence. Whatever power the demons had, the power of Jesus is much greater. And so this fourth snapshot is Jesus exercising the very authority of God over evil. Jesus here is showing us what God would do if he himself walked on earth, and all the amazing things that we longed for last time in our last video of a world rid of evil. That's what Jesus is doing. He's displaying God's clear work. Now, you may think it isn't clear. And if you don't think that God has made himself clear in Jesus, again, we've got a free book that we'd love to give to you. It's called If I Were God, I'd Make Myself Clearer. Again, just reach out to our office and we'd love to give you the copy of that book. But in each of these incidents, we've seen that Jesus has the answer to the problem presented to him. But what about us? What about our problem? Our problem is actually bigger than the weather. It's bigger than sickness. It's actually even bigger than death. Our problem is one of autonomy. Our problem is us, the problem of evil. How will Jesus give us an answer to that problem? Well, God's plan for dealing with our autonomy, I actually think, takes most people a little by surprise. Now, what happens on a purely human level is there's rising opposition to Jesus from the Jewish leaders. They see Jesus as a threat and they whip up the crowd, they ambush Jesus, they organise a trial, but it's a complete farce. There's accusations flung all around the court, and then to appease and to please the Jewish leaders and the Jewish crowd, the Roman governor of the time, Pontius Pilate, he orders that Jesus be crucified. And we're going to pick up the story at the crucifixion site just outside Jerusalem. It's a Friday afternoon in April, a bit over 2,000 years ago. And Jesus is on the cross. He has a criminal each side of him. And now as Jesus is killed, we're starting to notice that all around there's people mocking Jesus in their autonomy. And here in Luke chapter 23, and sentence 35, the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others, let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. They're mocking him. They're sneering at him. They're having a go at him. Now here at the death of Jesus, we have gathered mocking, defiance, conspiracy, shaking their fists against God and against his anointed one, his Christ the King. And as they stand supporting the murder of the chosen one, they sneer and mock. And it's actually pretty easy to identify this. Here at Introducing God. And I don't know how you have gone with this. Perhaps you've let some people know you've started to watch these videos. But what tends to happen is mocking. I think of one woman who came on the Introducing God course, and she would speak of the bagging and the mocking that she'd been copying from her workmates for coming along and investigating who God is. You're not still going to that God thing, are you? And she asked one night as we were talking about it, how do you Christians stand it? And it was about this time. She was getting to know God, and she's getting to know about her autonomy and getting to know a little bit more about the answer that's been provided through Jesus. And she was amazed at the mocking she was getting from her people at work just for investigating. It actually made her a little bit more resolute to keep going. But more than how do Christians stand it, how does God put up with it? All around, everyone is mocking his chosen king, Jesus. Well, sentence 39. Even one of the criminals being executed next to Jesus starts to sneer. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. Now, you've got a picture. There's 3 crosses up on the hill. The middle one is Jesus. There's a cross on his left and a cross on his right. And this bloke hanging there next to Jesus, he's on death row. He is hours from death. He's clearly done the wrong thing. He's about to meet God, and he's sneering at God's King Jesus. And there's people like that, aren't there? A friend of mine was diagnosed with brain cancer, and the doctors said to him, you're not going to have long to live. And I said to him, mate, come on, you've got every incentive now to put things right with God. But in his heart, and I found this tragic, he arrogantly, defiantly continued to shake his fist at God. He said, no, I don't want anything to do with that God stuff. Now, miraculously, he was healed. His brain cancer disappeared. And I went back to him and said, come on, mate, do you think, you've been spared for a reason? And the answer was no, and he still mocks. And he still sneers to this day. But not everyone is like that. The other criminal, his mate, he sort of, yells back across and thinks, this is crazy. Pick it up, verse 40. The other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said. Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly. We are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. The second criminal, he sees he's in not a position of strength. He's frightened of meeting God. He's seen that Jesus displays remarkable power, has the ability to do things that only God can do. And one of his reactions, yes, is to fear him. And the second criminal seems to be saying to the first, hey, don't you know this is God's man? Don't go playing fast and loose with that. Don't you fear God? He knows he's on death row. He knows he's minutes from meeting his maker. He sees he's declared autonomy. He knows he's done the wrong thing. He's in really serious trouble. And in sentence 42, he makes an astonishing statement. He says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He throws himself in dependence on God's king. He somehow sees that Jesus is the one from whom God, there's this kingdom, a kingdom he hasn't yet come into, and Jesus is somehow the king of God's after-death kingdom. And all around the mocking and the criminals in this, gets this amazing moment of clarity, this moment of insight that he reaches out in desperate dependence against all the peer group pressure, and he says, hey, Jesus, I'm with you. Please help me. And Jesus, God's King of the universe, looks back at the criminal next to him and says to him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. This is an amazing statement. This is a huge statement. Here is a promise from God's King, the King of God's kingdom, that this man will be with him in heaven. But what right does this man have to go to heaven? Well, none. None whatsoever, and that's the point. This man says to Jesus, hey, can I have a crumb? And Jesus says, here's the cake. He says, hey, can I have a share in your company? And Jesus says, have the whole company. This man, he says, hey, will you remember me? And Jesus says, here's a relationship. And here's the one man in the entire whole scriptures who has a cast iron guarantee from the lips of Jesus that he will be in heaven. And I want you to note some things about this man. He was never baptized. He never did communion. He was never confirmed. He'd actually never walked into a church. He'd never given money to anything. He doesn't know how to spell the word hymn. He's never been a moral pillar of society. If he knew what Rotary was, he wouldn't have joined. He's broken all the commandments, and the ones that he hasn't broken, he probably meant to. But yet he's the one man in the whole biography of God to whom Jesus sees and he says, you will be with me in paradise. More than any other statement in the whole of the Bible, just seconds before his death, Jesus completely rejects the idea we get to heaven by doing good works. This man did no good work. But what did he do? Well, he feared God. He identified in some sense his autonomy problem. He saw that he deserved to be punished. He recognized Jesus was God's king. And somehow he recognized that Jesus in his death was the answer to his problems. And he reaches out in dependent trust to King Jesus. He goes against the peer group. He goes against the mockers, and he trusts Jesus. And Jesus, well, he guarantees him a future in heaven. But do you see the problem though? How can Jesus do it? How can Jesus declare that this man's autonomy is dealt with? I mean, think back to our last video when we looked at Psalm 2. Remember how God was going to use an iron scepter to dash the rebels to pieces like pottery? That he was going to bring judgment on those who were autonomous, and he was going to deal justly with evil. Remember how it said you're going to break them with a rod of iron, you're going to shatter them like pottery? Remember that we established that the problem wasn't just out there, that the problem is us. Now, if justice is to be done, then we are on the uncomfortable side of justice. In the story of the hammer and the plate, as someone at the tables once said, we are the plate. And now Jesus is saying to this man, free entry to heaven, you're going to be with me in heaven. But could we do what the second criminal has done? If we were to reach out in dependent trust to Jesus, could he declare again that our autonomy problem is dealt with? Well, the clue is in sentence 41 of Luke 23. where one of the criminals says, we are getting punished justly. We are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Jesus had done nothing wrong. He's God's king on the planet. He's pleased with Jesus. There's no one on earth that God unequivocally delights in. It's not me. It's not you. It's none of us except Jesus. He's the only one who has consistently pleased his Father. Therefore, Jesus is the one who doesn't deserve punishment, the one who should never have died. And if that's true, then why did God send Jesus to die? Well, here's the answer. God punished Jesus instead of me. God punished Jesus instead of me. Jesus, in his death, took the anger of the Father that should have been declared and directed at me, and God punished Jesus in my place. That is why I can be forgiven and yet justice still be done. For God could not say that what we have done in declaring autonomy doesn't matter. It does matter. But now God is able to say, you know what, it does matter, and it's dealt with. The penalty has been paid. Jesus was crushed in my place, on my behalf. Jesus became the plate so I could go back to the table. It's extraordinary love, isn't it? It's just marvellous. And here is God sending his son Jesus so that he could justly crush evil and yet lovingly not crush me. But actually, it's even bigger than that. For it's not as though God sends Jesus as some third party. It's even more glorious, for Jesus is the Son of God. He is God himself. And so when Jesus dies, it is God himself dying. And if we read ourselves into this story, we're one of these criminals, aren't we? I mean, whoever we are autonomous before God. We are all on death row. We're all going to meet God at some point. And the question is, are we going to face God defiantly, mocking? Or will we face God fearing him, recognizing Jesus as God's King, the Son, recognizing justice must be done, and throwing ourselves dependently on King Jesus, who was crushed in our place? Now, if I could just speak personally for a moment, I actually found this a really difficult concept to grasp. Not so much the stopping, mocking, but throwing myself in dependent trust on Jesus. You see, I'd grown up with a picture of religion that you had to be good enough to be accepted by God. And I still remember sitting with my youth leader as he explained over and over again that I was wrong before God, and I was acutely aware of that, but that there's nothing I can do to make myself acceptable. There was nothing I could do or bring to the table to try and appease God, because that was a wrong understanding. That's not the God who we've begun to know. He's not a performance-based God waiting for you to pass some exam. He's will you trust me? I found that trusting difficult because I wanted to be a self-made person. And what I kept hearing was, you have to depend on God's charity, his free gift. It's all from God and it's none from me. And in the end, all I could do was be like the second criminal and beg and plead in dependent trust to the one in the middle on the cross, God the Son, Jesus. And so I want to ask you a question. Will you be the second criminal? Will you reach out in dependence? Will you plead for that crumb for Jesus to give you that cake? In our next video, we're going to see how God raised Jesus to life again. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to pray. Now, prayer is just speaking to God. But the prayer that we're going to work through is about turning back to God. It's a prayer of reaching out in dependence to Jesus. And for those who want to be like the second criminal, it's going to be an opportunity to reach out in dependence. I hope you can join us for our next video. It's been great having you along for our third session of Introducing God.